For more than a century, debates about the Bible's historicity have swung between two extremes. On one side, texts are treated as insulated literary constructions. On the other, archaeology or history is asked to deliver a single decisive verdict. Both approaches fail for the same reason. They isolate evidence that was never isolated in the real world. Ancient texts did not exist apart from history. They were embedded in legal systems, administrative practices, economic realities, naming conventions, political structures, and material culture. Those external realities leave traces, not just in the ground, but in archives, treaties, inscriptions, consensus practices, and bureaucratic habits preserved across the ancient Near East and Mediterranean world. In this series, we introduce the Interlocking Anchor Model, or IAM, a framework for evaluating biblical texts by measuring how well they align with independent anchors in archaeology and secular history. An anchor is any externally constrained feature, something that does not depend on the biblical text for its existence or dating. A legal form attested in treaties, a naming pattern preserved in administrative records, a political institution documented in inscriptions, a material practice confirmed archaeologically. Individually, any one anchor can be debated. Archaeology is fragmentary. Texts are incomplete. History is noisy. But when anchors from distinct, independent domains, material culture, extrabiblical texts, legal corpora, administrative systems, and social institutions, converge on the same historical world, coincidence becomes an increasingly poor explanation. The interlocking anchor model does not assume inspiration, reliability, or unity. It does not privilege the Bible over other ancient sources. It simply asks a structural question. How many independent features of a text can be externally constrained before the range of plausible explanations collapses? In this episode, we'll define what qualifies as an anchor, explain how independence matters, and show why cumulative convergence across archaeology and secular history changes the rules of historical debate. No conclusions yet, no dates yet, just a method for determining when history stops being flexible and starts pushing back. The interlocking anchor model, a general framework for historical verification using archaeology and secular history. Abstract. Historical debates concerning biblical texts have frequently relied on isolated evidentiary domains, archaeology, linguistics, literary criticism, or redaction theory, treated as decisive in isolation. Such approaches repeatedly fail, not due to lack of evidence, but because no single domain can bear the full explanatory burden of complex ancient texts embedded in real historical systems. This paper introduces the Interlocking Anchor Model, or IAM, a generalizable framework for evaluating the historical plausibility of any ancient text by measuring cumulative convergence across independent external anchors drawn from archaeology, secular history, administrative records, legal corpora, and material culture. IAM formalizes how independent evidence constrains interpretive flexibility and identifies the point at which coincidence becomes an insufficient explanation. The model is methodologically neutral, book agnostic, and applicable beyond biblical studies to any historically embedded textual corpus. Problem of isolated evidence in historical analysis. Modern historical criticism often oscillates between two methodological extremes. In one, texts are treated as largely self-contained literary artifacts, interpreted primarily through internal features such as vocabulary, style, or thematic development. In the other, archaeology or external history is asked to deliver singular verdicts, either validating or invalidating entire textual traditions. Both approaches share a structural flaw. They isolate evidence that was never isolated in antiquity. Ancient texts were produced within functioning societies governed by legal systems, administrative practices, economic realities, political institutions, and material constraints. No text existed independently of these systems, and no system operated independently of the others. IAM begins from a simple premise. Historical plausibility cannot be assessed by any single line of evidence. It must be evaluated through cumulative external constraint. Anchors defined: external constraint and independence. An anchor is defined as any feature of a text that can be externally constrained by evidence independent of the text itself. Anchors do not arise from literary self-reference, they arise from archaeology and secular history. Anchor domains include archaeology, material culture, settlement patterns, technology, inscriptions; administrative history, census practices, taxation systems, bureaucratic structures; legal corpora, treaty forms, law codes, contractual norms; economic systems, trade practices, weights and measures, labor organization; onomastics, naming conventions preserved in external archives; political institutions, kingship models, vassalage, imperial administration; linguistic environment, loanwords and register constrained by external contact. A micro-anchor is a single, narrowly defined instance within one of these domains. Crucially, IAM requires independence. Independence does not mean isolation, it means non-derivation. A legal structure does not derive from a naming pattern. A political institution does not derive from material culture. When anchors originate in distinct external systems, convergence becomes structurally meaningful. Interlocking constraint and historical convergence. IAM is not concerned with whether any single anchor can be disputed. All anchors can be disputed. The question is whether multiple independent anchors converge on the same historical explanatory space. As anchors accumulate, they begin to interlock. Each additional anchor narrows the range of plausible explanations. Hypotheses that once appeared viable must introduce auxiliary assumptions: coincidence, imitation, selective preservation, or systematic reconstruction to remain intact. This process mirrors constraint propagation in engineering and the physical sciences. When constraints accumulate, degrees of freedom collapse. IAM applies this logic to historical interpretation. The mathematical logic of accumulation. IAM formalizes cumulative reasoning using Bayesian reference, not to claim numerical precision, but to enforce methodological transparency. Let H represent a historical hypothesis about a text. Let E represent observed evidence drawn from external anchors. Equation 1, Bayesian update. This is written as P times H given E equals P times E given H times P times H over P times E given H times P times H plus P times E given not H times P times not H. How to read this aloud? The probability of the hypothesis, given the evidence, equals the probability of observing that evidence if the hypothesis is true, multiplied by the prior probability of the hypothesis divided by the probability of observing the evidence under the hypothesis plus the probability of observing the evidence if the hypothesis is false. Spoken in shorthand, posterior equals likelihood times prior normalized by all competing explanations. Equation formalizes a basic principle. Explanations gain plausibility when they make evidence unsurprising and lose plausibility when they require coincidence. Equation 2. Accumulation of independent anchors. Let the evidence consist of multiple independent anchors. E equals E sub 1, E sub 2, and on and on and on and so on until E sub n. The cumulative update is expressed as the probability of the hypothesis given all pieces of evidence from 1 through n equals the product from I equals 1 to n of the probability of the hypothesis given each individual piece of evidence. Plain language reading. Each independence anchor updates the hypothesis, and the combined effect is the multiplication of those updates. This formulation makes explicit that no single anchor carries the argument. Confidence emerges only through accumulation. Archaeology and secular history as anchor sources. IAM treats archaeology and secular history not as corroborative tools, but as primary constraint mechanisms. Archaeology anchors texts to material capabilities, settlement realities, technological limits. Secular history anchors texts to administrative practices, political institutions, economic systems, legal norms. When textual features align consistently with externally attested systems, historical plausibility increases. When alignment fails, interpretive cost rises. IAM therefore evaluates texts not by whether archaeology confirms them, but by whether external systems and internal claims coexist coherently. Applying IAM to ancient texts, a general framework. IAM is genre agnostic. Legal texts generate anchors in law and administration. Narrative texts generate anchors in political and social systems. Prophetic texts generate anchors in institutional critique and social reality. Apocalyptic texts generate anchors in symbolic systems constrained by historical expectation. Epistolary texts generate anchors in rhetoric, networks, and organization. The absence of certain anchors is itself informative. IAM evaluates not perfection, but structural fit under constraint. Stress testing competing hypotheses. IAM does not privilege any historical hypothesis. Early, late, composite, redactional, and pseudoepigraphical models are all admissible. What differs is cost. As anchors accumulate, hypotheses must explain why certain external systems align, why others do not, whether mismatches require coincidence or mechanism. Hypotheses that remain stable under accumulation gain plausibility. Those that require escalating auxiliary assumptions accumulate probabilistic debt. Why IAM is not confessional in scholarship. IAM does not assume inspiration, reliability, unity, canonical authority. It evaluates historical plausibility, not theological truth. A text may be theologically false and historically coherent, or theologically meaningful and historically implausible. IAM adjudicates neither belief nor value, only explanatory fit. Conclusion. The interlocking anchor model reframes historical analysis away from isolated proof and toward cumulative external constraint. By grounding interpretation in archaeology and secular history, IAM identifies the point at which interpretive flexibility collapses under evidentiary load. IAM does not seek decisive proof. It seeks structural accountability. When independent anchors interlock tightly enough, coincidence ceases to function as a serious explanation. At that point, history stops being malleable and begins to push back. The significance of IAM lies not in the conclusions it may support, but in the methodological discipline it imposes. It provides a shared framework in which competing hypotheses can be tested under the same rules, with assumptions made explicit and costs paid openly. That shift from rhetorical certainty to cumulative constraint is the contribution of the interlocking anchor model. So isn't this just apologetics with a different vocabulary? No. Apologetics begins with a conclusion and works backward. IAM begins with external constraint. Archaeology, administrative history, legal corpora, and material culture, and asks how much interpretive freedom remains once those constraints are applied. The model does not protect any conclusion. It allows hypotheses to weaken or fail under accumulation. Are you assuming the Bible is historically reliable from the start? No need. IAM assumes nothing about reliability, inspiration, or authority. Biblical texts are treated as historical artifacts embedded in real societies. Any plausibility they gain is earned only insofar as independent external systems align with their internal claims. Reliability is an outcome, not a premise. Why should archaeology and secular history carry more weight than textual analysis? Because archaeology and secular history exist independently of the biblical text. They constrain what was materially, administratively, and institutionally possible. Textual analysis is valuable, but without external constraint, it remains interpretive. IAM integrates both, but external anchors set the boundary conditions. Isn't archaeology too fragmentary to support this kind of model? Fragmentation undermines single anchor arguments, not cumulative ones. IAM does not require complete data. It asks whether multiple independent fragments consistently align. Fragmentary data actually strengthens the model by reducing the likelihood of systematic coincidence. How do you know these anchors are truly independent? Independence in IAM means non-derivation, not isolation. A naming convention does not derive from a legal system. A treaty structure does not derive from material culture. Where partial dependence exists, weight is reduced rather than eliminated. The model remains conservative under dependency. Couldn't later authors deliberately imitate earlier historical features? Imitation is always possible. IAM does not deny that. What it measures is cost. As anchors accumulate across independent external systems, successful imitation requires increasing historical precision without error, leakage, or contradiction. At scale, imitation becomes less plausible than embeddedness. Isn't Bayesian reasoning subjective because of priors? Priors matter when evidence is scarce. As independent anchors accumulate, priors rapidly lose influence, a mathematical property of Bayesian updating. IAM explicitly allows broad priors to avoid bias and evaluates whether convergence overwhelms starting assumptions. What happens when archaeology or history contradicts the texts? The model registers that tension. IAM does not require perfect alignment. Contradictions reduce posterior plausibility and signal where hypotheses need refinement. That framework penalizes overconfidence rather than concealing conflict. Does IAM prove the Bible is true? I certainly hope so, but that's not the point of IAM. It does not evaluate theological truth, moral authority, or inspiration. It evaluates historical plausibility under cumulative external constraint. A text can be historically coherent and theologically false, or theologically meaningful and historically implausible. IAM adjudicates neither belief nor value. Why apply this framework to biblical texts at all? Because biblical texts are unusually rich in detail and densely embedded in known historical systems, making them ideal stress tests. But IAM is not Bible specific. The same framework applies to any ancient text situated within archaeologically and historically constrained societies. Isn't this just formalizing what historians already do? Yes, and that is precisely the point. IAM makes explicit what is often left implicit, how evidence accumulates, where assumptions enter, and when explanations incur cost. Formalization improves accountability without inventing new evidence. We're basically taking something that was formerly implicit and we're spelling it out for you. What would falsify a hypothesis under IAM? Failure under accumulation. If a hypothesis repeatedly requires coincidence, selective preservation, or auxiliary assumptions to survive external constraint, its plausibility declines. IAM does not shield hypotheses. It accelerates their evaluation. What's the central claim of the interlocking anchor model? Historical plausibility does not hinge on decisive proof, but on cumulative convergence across independent external systems. When those systems interlock tightly enough, coincidence ceases to be a credible explanation. The question is not whether any single archaeological find or historical parallel can be disputed. The question is how many independent constraints can align before interpretation runs out of room. So here's the conclusion. Why the interlocking anchor model collapses fringe theories. The persistence of fringe theories in online discourse is not primarily a problem of missing evidence, it is a problem of missing constraint. Many YouTube based theories about biblical texts survive by isolating a single domain: linguistics, literary style, perceived anachronisms, or selective archaeological claims, and treating that domain as sufficient to overturn the historical plausibility of an entire corpus. What these approaches share is not rigor, but methodological insulation. The interlocking anchor model removes that insulation. IAM collapses fringe theory by refusing to allow any hypothesis to operate within a single evidentiary silo. Archaeology, secular history, administrative systems, legal corpora, material culture, and external textual archives are treated not as optional corroboration, but as non-negotiable constraints. A theory is no longer evaluated by how clever it sounds in isolation, but by how well it survives when multiple independent external systems are allowed to press inward simultaneously. Fringe theories typically rely on interpretive freedom, flexible dates, selective parallels, speculative motifs, and unfalsifiable reconstruction. IAM systematically strips that freedom away. Each independent anchor reduces the degrees of interpretive motion. Each external constraint increases the cost of coincidence, imitation, or conspiracy. At scale, these theories do not fail because they are refuted by a single counterexample, but because they cannot remain coherent under cumulative load. Most importantly, IAM changes the rules of engagement. It shifts debate away from rhetorical dominance, novelty, or contrarian appeal, and towards structural plausibility under constraint. YouTube fringe theories thrive in environments where evidence can be endlessly reinterpreted without consequence. IAM introduces consequence. It makes assumption visible, costs measurable, and evasions cumulative. In this sense, the interlocking anchor model does not argue against fringe theories, it outgrows them. Once archaeology and secular history are allowed to interlock across independent domains and independent books, speculative explanations lose the freedom they require to survive. What remains is not certainty, but accountability, and under that standard, many popular online theories collapse not because they are unpopular, but because they cannot bear the weight of reality pressing in from all sides.